Greetings, I'm John Duvall. Welcome to another Truth Factor discussion. Today is September the 13th, 2017. And on today's discussion, we're going to conclude our look at lessons learned by preachers. We'll be talking initially about some time management ideas and problems that we face. And then, time permitting, we're going to talk about some advice that we would give to an individual, a young man thinking about becoming a full-time preacher as you would, living of the gospel, and some advice that we might share with them. We want to thank you for your interest and your willingness to join us today. If you're watching us at either live.truthfactor.com or on our Facebook page at facebook.com/truthfactorlive, you can participate. And Paul, if you would you please tell them how they can participate in today's study?
Certainly, John. As we think about that, if you're watching us on the Facebook Live video feed, if you just make a comment below the video, you'll be able to interact with us that way. And we'll do our best to introduce your comments and questions as we study along. If you are watching at live.truthfactor.com, there is a chat window there, and you can log in using the chat role or social media or just as a guest, and it will allow you to make comments, ask questions. We can bring those in hopefully a timely manner, and that way we can all interact together in this Bible study. And we do invite your participation. We value what you have to say as well as what we have to say, because we all want to find out what God has to say.
Paul, I appreciate that. And let's go ahead and jump into our study. We're just a couple minutes behind with our starting. So what we were looking at last week, and actually the week before that, as we said, lessons learned by preachers. And we won't review everything that we've talked about. We're just going to pick up where we left off. And I would think that probably one of the greatest problems that preachers face, and maybe one of the things that is oftentimes overlooked as being not really as important, is the area of time management. Preaching is a bit different than your standard job. One of my kids one time, when they were asked by a teacher what their daddy did for a living, they said, "My daddy doesn't work, he's a preacher." And oftentimes when you kind of hear that, you chuckle a little bit about that concept there. But unlike a regular job where you have a boss or a manager over you, and you have a set number of hours and your productivity must meet a certain point, and there is this accountability that comes with it. When it comes to preaching, we don't see that. I mean, some congregations, a men's meeting may try to make some sort of binding agreement with the local evangelist, and he could agree to that. But when push comes to shove, it's on the shoulders of the preacher, that individual, to properly manage his time so that everything gets done and what is expected is completely fulfilled. And so, Tom, that's kind of an issue sometimes that I think can plague preachers if they don't properly prepare themselves. Wouldn't you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, time management is a challenge. Well, first of all, it's a challenge in life.
That's true.
It's not just a challenge for being a preacher, but it's a challenge as a Christian. And many of the things that we're going to talk about for the next few moments don't just apply to preachers, but they certainly do apply to preachers. And we need to give double thought to them because of that. And there's just a lot of sides to dealing with the time management issue. And so we'll just talk about a few of those. Something that you've already mentioned here is as preachers, we really don't have a time clock in the same way that other people do. And quite honestly, if a congregation puts you on a time clock, they don't understand your work, because there's things that you have to do outside of the office. I mean, I don't think that all you're going to do as a preacher is spend all of your time studying the Word of God. Yes, you need to devote adequate time to that. But if you're in your office all day long and never going out to visit people and things like that, that can be a challenge within itself. But at the same time, because there is no time clock, there's also the ability to not devote adequate time to the work that you have actually been given to do. And that becomes a big concern in our lives as Christians. And one of the observations that I would make is, even though we don't punch a time clock, we are, for lack of a better term, hired. And you might want to note that Paul made the observation that it is required of stewards that one be found faithful. You need to realize that you're not hiding from your employer no matter what you're doing. We hear so much about the workplace and people goofing off today and not giving a full day's worth of work. Well, you're not going to hide from your employer, because your employer is God. And we are told in the Bible, in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 and 16, see then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time, because the days are evil. That redeeming the time is also used over in the book of Colossians. And it's an observation that we have to use our time in a wise way. So that's the first observation that I would make when I talk about time management. Another observation that I would make in dealing with time manager is to realize that you are a Christian first. And I've actually thought about this in a lot of things. I just finished preaching a series of lessons on elders. And one of the observations I made in our responsibilities to elders is realize they are Christians, first. And so you treat them the way you would any other Christian. Being Christians first, we need to act like a Christian, and that includes our time. And the Bible gives so many passages that just address the idea of time management in our lives. But having said that, as a preacher, we have more time to do some of the things that someone who has a full-time job cannot do. Like every Christian ought to be concerned about their brethren and, spend time visiting the sick as you have opportunity, helping the needy and helping needy brethren, and dealing with whatever concerns, time studying the Bible, time praying. But as a preacher, you may have a little more time to do a little more of that. So you can build that into your work. And I see that as a good thing to give consideration to, and a realization. We know that people oftentimes have misunderstandings about preaching. And another observation that I would make is expect to be misunderstood. And anybody who has preached for any length of time understands this. John, you started off with the joke. Where the child said, my daddy's a preacher, he doesn't work, and so on. Well, I've had times when during a gospel meeting, somebody will come up to me, or they'll come up to me on the Sunday following the gospel meeting. So did you enjoy your week off? I mean, it's a total misunderstanding. Those times, usually they're not easier, they're more challenging. Is what you're dealing with in those particular circumstances. And it's easy for you to be misunderstood by individuals. They think that you have all the time in the world to go visit everybody and to be the personal chauffeur of members when they have a need, or to take care of the grounds and those types of things. Now, you can do that. And like I said, as a preacher, you may have a little more time in some of those areas, or you can factor in some more of those times as you're doing your work. But expect to be misunderstood, and then you just have to kind of deal with those misunderstandings. So I know there's some other things that we want to talk about, but I'm just going to stop it right there and see what kind of thoughts do you have up to this point talking about this.
Well, Tom, you were talking about people misunderstanding you. Are you talking about as far as a preacher and your use of your time?
Yeah, exactly. People, again, they think the only time you work is on Sunday morning, and they think, oh, you may spend a little time putting some sermons together. But other than that, they don't appreciate a lot of other things that are associated with the work.
Okay. Well, any of y'all have any comments or thoughts or anything you want to kind of add to what Tom was talking about?
I'm trying to think of exactly how to say what I'm thinking. That's a good thing to do. I guess that you ought to. Sometimes you have to manage well your public persona, or that's not the right word. I'm not talking about like publicity.
No, but your time in public.
But what folks need to know is sometimes, without patting yourself on the back and coming across in that way, that the congregation does know what you're doing, I guess is what I'm saying. In other words, you don't need to grandstand and say, hey, look what I did, but find some kind of a humble way or an informative way just to share with the congregation what your week looks like. I suppose for most preachers that may be different among all of us, but to give them an idea of things that you are involved in, maybe in giving a report about those that you visited that were spiritually weak or falling away, or home Bible studies that you've had. If it's possible, take other brethren along with you. I might even suggest that if you suspect that there might be those who are going to be critical of your time management, keep a diary, a daily diary, and say, well, today I went to the office. I've done this before. Today I went to the office, then I went by the hospital, and just kind of a list of things that were involved in my day as I maybe was studying for lessons or for Bible classes, or whatever it is that I'm doing. But find a way that you can, I guess, be accountable for the trust that's been placed in you and being supported in the gospel.
Yep. Good point there.
Yeah,
Anybody else? Ryan?
I think it's a great point, as Paul makes it there. In the past, I've always made it a point, coming from secular jobs, that accountability is important, that I write a monthly report of whatever work I'm doing and turn it in. In the last congregation I worked in, we didn't have overseers, so I turned it over to the men every month. I would report out all the different things I had done. And again, as Paul is saying, not because you're boasting about it, but because there needs to be some kind of accountability. People need to understand what it is you're doing. And maybe they can say, you know what, Brian, we'd like you to put your time, in another area or something like that. It gives an opportunity for some direction if you want that. I still make those reports now to overseers, and I turn over to them every month a list of the things I'm doing and studying. And that way they also have a good sense of people who are being studied with, who need encouragement and things like that. And I would strongly encourage that, because that accountability also gives a sense of what it is that an evangelist is doing, so that as Paul told Titus that you need to be an example of the kind of person you need to be, the example of the person you're supposed to be, that good deeds, purity, and doctrine, you're doing that in a way that sometimes people don't see, because maybe they're only seeing what you're doing in the pulpit, and give them other opportunities that you're the example of what you're supposed to be doing.
Good point. Good point to think about. Any other thoughts up to that point?
Tom, here in a little bit, will you be talking some about actual time management, like during the week, possible suggestions and things like that? At least a little bit, not the details, which you all might want to bring out some details, but we have a couple of comments in the Facebook chat, not Facebook, but Truth Factor chat. Bear with me, and I'll bring that up here. You want to start with Daryl's?
We've also got Brendan above,
as opposed to Brendan below.
Mine has Brendan above it. So
go ahead.
So,
I'll throw it over for you.
Yeah. Okay. And Brendan, incidentally, Brendan was supposed to be with us, but he's got technical difficulties today, so he's just listening. So anyway, so we'll bring comments in as they come along. But he said, I think the first thing that young preachers need to learn is that preaching is a way of life, not a 40-hour-a-week job. And that's a true statement. The thing to understand about that, you're incorporating the life of a Christian into your work. And I hesitate to say more so than others, but others when they're on the job working for whoever it is, their actual Christian duty is to be responsible to their employers. Like I said, our employer is God, so it's not a 40-hour-a-week punch a time clock. There's a lot more involved in it from that standpoint. And then the other one, Daryl makes the point here. Maybe I have been fortunate, but most brethren understand how much time is involved in preparing sermons and classes. And Daryl, I agree with that. Most people definitely do, but there are those that are misinformed. And there are those that do not, do not comprehend what all is involved. And one of the best ways to get people to appreciate what a preacher has to do is to have some of the members preach a sermon every once in a while. It's a wake up call, or have them teach classes, the adult classes and those types of things. It becomes a wake up call as to how involved it is. What, John?
Tom, unless they do a better job than you do, then that's when you want to rethink that.
Yeah. Speaking of that, jokingly, I know this was brought up. I don't know if it was last week or after the conversation, but preachers that don't let anybody else into their pulpit, if you will. Yeah. And I heard one time of a preacher that had said that, and he said, they asked him, "Why don't you let anybody else preach?" He said, "Well, the way that I figure it is if they're better than me, then you might want to replace me with them. And if they're worse than me, you're better off with me." So they just kind of reason it that way.
That's kind of the double-edged sword of gospel meetings, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But I tell you what, I do look forward to gospel meetings, and quite often in our gospel meetings, they are better than me. But that can serve as a form of motivation. Yeah. To just keep moving forward. So anyways, back to some of the points, we've talked about kind of the disposition behind it. Now to get into some more practical things. And one of them is, and this goes along with what Brendan was saying here a moment ago, is you're always on call. That's something to realize as a preacher, is you are going to be on call. You may be needed to go do something to help somebody with something. And while there are things to understand about being on call, and what I mean by that is it's possible for you to be taken advantage of and to allow yourself to be taken advantage of above and beyond. But you may be needed for something, and if you are, make yourself available to do whatever that is. Above and beyond that, another thing is when we're doing the work that we're supposed to be doing, preachers also need some downtime. They need time to rest. Now, I realize there are some that get way more than they need. And they abuse the system and so on. But there are also preachers that wear them out so much that they keep their stress level high, and they don't take the time to, like what Jesus told his disciples. There were some times he basically said, "Let's set aside and rest for a while." He took them aside, and there's a time for it. Jesus found many times in solitude, where he would, for lack of a better term, take breaks, or at least in some instances he would try to take breaks, and the crowds wouldn't let him and so on. But you need to find time to just stop and rest and to replenish yourself. And something else associated with this, and we kind of touched on this a little bit last week, is that with your family responsibilities as a preacher, you need to take time to deal with your family, or to be with your family and interact with your family just like anybody else. Don't so book your schedule so much that you don't have any time with your children to be a father to your children, to help out your wife, who's struggling to be the mother while you are the preacher, and so on. Don't be gone all the time. Set aside family time that you're going to use to be with them, and that family time needs to be virtually set in stone unless some absolute emergency comes up. So yeah, so don't neglect your family when you are doing these things. I've heard of sad examples of preachers who would go out and win multitudes of souls, and they would lose their children spiritually because they were never there for their children. And we need to make sure that we don't let that happen. Any thoughts on that?
Who wants
Or
to go
other things
first?
along that lines, with how much time?
It's
Oh,
good
Brian's
stuff,
talking.
Tom. No, I was just saying it's good stuff. Appreciate those thoughts, and I think it is important. Everything you're saying is things we all need to consider, and it's good for brethren to hear these things too.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, that brings me up to my my third point, and this is basically a key to dealing with time management is budgeting, and this is what John was asking about a few moments ago. What can we do to help ourselves? I think one of the best things to do is to budget your time. If you want to control your spending habits, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to know what's coming in and what's going out, and then you got to learn to budget so that you've got you don't have more going out than is coming in. That's the key to staying out of debt financially, and that's also the key to staying out of debt with your time. Is learn to manage it properly, and prepare yourself a budget on a weekly basis. Maybe on Monday. I kind of think that Monday's a good day to sit back, and you could do several things on a Monday that would be helpful to set you up for your week if you will do this. Number one, sit back and reflect on what you did yesterday. The sermons, how they were received, so on. It might be a good time to go ahead and process those lessons if you are putting them into some type of an electronic format, such as if you have a website, Facebook page, those types of things, how you want to get that material out to the public, those types of things. Do that on Monday. On Monday, sit down and write out your schedule for the week. If you can, figure out what you're going to preach the following Sunday, what classes you've got to teach, invitations. If you write bulletin articles, find the topic. And if you could get all that stuff done on Monday, and also on Monday, follow up on the business from Sunday. And what I mean by that is follow up on the sick. If you're going to make your phone calls, if you've got somebody that's struggling spiritually, make your phone call on Monday. If you'd get all that done on Monday, the amount of stress that will relieve for the remainder of the week is just phenomenal. I've often said one of the biggest challenges as a preacher, at least, and this is to me, one of the biggest challenges to preachers is determining what to preach and making it relevant. And where that especially becomes a challenge is when you've been someplace for a long period of time. If you've just moved to a place, you've actually probably got 2 to 3 years worth of material. You can go without repeating anything. But when you get beyond that length of time, you look at what the brethren need. You got to ask that question, what do they need? But you also have to step back and just make sure that you're balanced in your preaching, which is why, as a part of a budget, I know John does some budgeting along this line, and I'll mention him or let him talk about this in just a minute. But I like to develop series of lessons. And some of the things that I've done, I don't do it every single service, but like the first Sunday night of the month, I preach a psalm. So I know what that one's going to be every month. The fifth Sunday night, I preach a song. I preach a sermon from a song. And I've been going through virtually on Sunday morning, year-long series on various broad topics. Like, for example, my theme this year is the New Testament church. And quite honestly, I'm wondering if I'm going to get through it by the end of the year. Because there's so much to be said. But if you'll sit there and outline that and plan weeks in advance, that actually helps you with your stress level, and it helps you focus the direction that you're going. So it helps you use your time
Okay.
more wisely from that standpoint. So that's some of the suggestions that I have dealing with that. Anything that anybody wants to add to that?
Well, I'll step in here for just a moment. You referenced something, and I'm gonna talk about it because I have it, but tragically I don't do it the way that I need to. But one of the biggest challenges I faced a number of years ago is, I got to where I hated the week to week. Now what am I going to preach? And you're right about series, Tom. Series can work very well, but at some point they run dry. You have to move on to another one. And members' attention span and what they follow. I mean, if you were to do a 5-year every single Sunday series on John 3:16, at some point they're going to grow weary of that.
Right, or even on the full Gospel of Luke.
Yeah, exactly. And so what I did some years back, but going back to around probably 2000, 2001, I sat down and sketched out a series of topics that needed to be dealt with. Some could be dealt with once a year or once every 2 years. Others needed to be dealt with once every 6 weeks by my judgment. And it only pertained to the Sunday morning sermons, but I would kind of sketch it out. It wouldn't mean that I would title every one of them, and then some of them would have subsets so that it would give you more opportunities, like on the subject of salvation or the work of the church. Earlier last year, I went through and began revamping it. Now, the sad thing is, sometimes I deviate from that, and you find the need to do that. But the other thing
that's
is,
not a sad thing.
well, I know
Just a
it's
necessity.
but it is a big relief to be able to look at the list and say, okay, this coming Sunday, this is what I've got to talk about. Now let me get prepped for that.
Right.
The other thing is time management. And I want to share a couple ideas here, but before I do, are there any thoughts or comments from anyone? I want to make sure I didn't step over anybody. Time management is extremely personal, and everything Tom said I agree with completely. And I am not the poster child for time management. I'm the child on the milk box of time management lost. You got to find it. And through the years, I've tried different ways. Some people try hourly. Okay, I'm gonna go to the office, and from 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock, I'm gonna do this, and so forth. And so I'm going to share with you something real quick that I put together. And again, I'll confess I don't follow it the way that I would really like to. But this right here is, there it is. This right here, if you can see it, is a project-based. And what it is, it's color-coded 2 different ways. I like to take either Friday off. Okay, that gives me Friday and Saturday together as a weekend. Sometimes, though, we found as a family it's better to take Monday. So I got Sunday and Monday, 2 days back to back there. So Sunday's really not an off day, so that's not a good example. But anyway, I've color coded it. So if a week comes along that I want to work for sure on Monday and have to take Friday off, then everything in pink and in white is what must be done. And so if you set a project, by the time Monday's over with, I need to have my Sunday morning sermon pretty much done. And I need to have the Tuesday morning Bible class prepped and ready to go. It doesn't matter if it takes me 3 or 4 hours. I need to get them done. Whereas if, let's say, I take Monday off, well, then you default to the orangish, yellowy, cream, whatever color that is. And then Tuesday is the start, and you see exactly what to do. But the thing is, you've got to figure out what works for yourself. I mean, every preacher does, and you've got to figure out, what am I expected to do? What does the congregation need me to do? What are my responsibilities? Wayne said this a couple weeks ago, Tom. You might remember this. He said when he first started preaching, he spent a lot of his time studying. And finally, one day it occurred to him, wait a minute, they want me to actually talk about something on Sunday, And sometimes we can get so involved in our personal studies that we forget what's coming up on Sunday. And so it's a huge challenge. And if you don't get it figured out when you're young, it'll always be a problem. At least that's my opinion anyway.
Amen. And that, John, I've seen your list. That's why I mentioned you earlier, because I'm glad you brought this up, because it gives a good example. And what that is it's a time budget.
Yeah, exactly. And you've got to have, in my opinion, a topic budget. You know, where you got to know where you're going. You know, and it's been once said, lay out where you want to be in 5 years, then 4 years, then 3 years. You know, how are you going to get to that point? You know, what do you want to cover? And
Right.
you know,
Yeah, and one other observation about that list of lessons that you put together, John, is you made sure it was balanced.
I tried to.
That
I tried to.
that
Yeah.
was one of your goals in that series or in that study. And incidentally, you know, you made the observation, you know, you don't rigidly stick to it and so on. But the good thing about having a list like that is if you have to veer from it, and truthfully, as preachers, we're going to have to veer.
Oh yeah.
You know, there are times where if you're in the middle of a series, you might have to stop the series and deal with something.
Yeah. Or
And
situation.
nothing wrong with that.
Yeah,
But
that's
incidentally, if you got to deal with something, you're not a loss as to what you're going to preach the next week. You know,
That's right.
because I mean, it's been established. This is what's needed. But at the same time, you don't have that question. Okay, what type of a sermon do I need to preach this particular Sunday based on what I've already done? So you've got that. And incidentally, along that same lines, somehow keep track of the sermons that you've preached.
Oh,
You know,
absolutely.
you've got to do that somehow so that you don't become overly repetitive, either in a particular area, or even repeating the same sermon every 2 to 3 years because you forgot that you preached it, or even, you know, I preached something on this 4 months ago, you know, that kind of a thing. So keep some kind of a log of the sermons that you preach. Now, in my case, my log is online. You know, it's. I mean, I've just got it listed. These are the sermons I've preached over, I think, last 6-7 years. Every single sermon I've preached is listed. So it serves as a dual purpose because you all have access to the outlines. So, anyways, that's that particular thought.
Well, Tom, let me jump in. Since we're talking about time management, we've got about 20 minutes left in our study, so we might want to move on. I think Brian had one more, maybe a thought that would still pertain to this before we get to our advice to young preachers section.
Yeah.
I don't. Let's just go. We'll go ahead and move on. That's okay.
Right.
Okay. You want to do that?
Yeah. Well, honestly, let me just mention what Brian said, because I think it's a good point. I just put above that, you know, be careful not to overfill your life so much, as with any Christian, so that you don't have the time to do everything that needs to be done. You got to prioritize things. And the point that Brian was making, and I'll attribute this to Brian, he says it's not wrong to say no. You know, I mean, as preachers, we've got to learn. You are not the church errand boy. You are not the taxi for every single person. Now, does that mean that you don't do those things or you can't do those? No, I'm not saying that. But you're not obligated to drop everything you're doing every time that somebody wants you to take them somewhere or to go do this for them or to do that. And if you do that, two things are going to happen, or they're going to take undue advantage of you, and you're going to find that more and more and more happening, and then that's going to cause your stress and your frustration level to go up. So don't let that happen. Anyways, enough of that, and I'm done with time.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and segue into some of the advice that we might give to men who are considering going into, and we call this full-time preaching. I mean, that's a man-made term. Paul uses the reference to those who live of the gospel, which means that they're supported by a local congregation or other congregations for this endeavor. So we're talking about these individuals and what advice that we might have for them. Let's see. Some of this we've talked a little bit about. I tell you what, Tom, let's go ahead and let me throw the first opportunity here to Brian, and then if we have time, we'll come back to the first point that you've got listed there. Would that work well?
Yeah, fine. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Go ahead, Brian. What would be your first suggestion or advice for younger preachers?
Well, all the advice I would give is advice that was given to me. And
Okay.
there's a lot of different things that I was told, and some of it's good, and some of it I just kind of put on a shelf in my mind. didn't necessarily follow. But one of the good pieces of advice I got was not to be too quick to change things right away. Now, of course, sometimes you walk into a situation where something may need to be changed. But somebody said, Brian, wait about a year before you suggest any big changes that you think ought to happen or something like that. Get to know the brethren, get to know the circumstances. And I realized what they were saying was that there's a need to establish a reputation of humility and listening before we actually step in to do some of the works that we need to do. It's important to understand that. I think sometimes we get a tendency to want to establish a reputation for ourselves. And it's hard, sometimes that's one of the temptations of being a preacher is you'd like to be a preacher that everybody knows about, and I sometimes struggle, with a very worldly desire to say, boy, I wish people had heard about me, or, I wish I was well respected or well known. And ironically, it's probably a little more profitable not to have a reputation, because I think a lot of times problems come out of that of all different kinds. And in that idea, in that sense, I know sometimes people seem to try to make a reputation by being controversial or being dogmatic on things that are not necessarily the doctrine of Christ. And I think that again doesn't do us well. It doesn't behoove us. And we need to understand that being controversial, having the extreme opinion on things, or always being the person who disagrees, isn't really the same thing as being an effective evangelist. And so it's important to understand that we're not here to establish a reputation for ourselves, and we're not here to establish the changes that need to be changed right away. For the first year, for the first while, evangelists need to be listening well. They need to be paying attention to what's going on around them and getting to know brethren. I know that's a comment that I believe Britton wanted to make later on, but it is important to kind of get to know everything. And I would suggest along that line, that's why it's so important that an evangelist demonstrates the characteristic of humility. It's really tempting to want to say, I know the answer to everything. Every time somebody has a question, I jump right in because I know the answer to everything. And I know I struggle even with that even now. But particularly when I first started preaching, I felt like it was necessary for me to have the answer to every question. And a lot of times, all that really created was a sense of being a know-it-all. One of my children once came home from school and said, Dad, they gave me a really great comment today in class. I said, oh, yeah, what was it? They said, I know everything. And I said, well, did they say you're a know-it-all? Yep, that's what they said. And I said, well, that's not a good thing. That's not a compliment. And a preacher who knows everything, it may not be a compliment. We want to be people that are studying, that are learning, and we don't have the answer to everything. And it's an easy desire to want to know everything, but we have to understand that one of the chief characteristics, one of the chief qualifications of an evangelist is that they practice and reveal humility. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 25 speaks about the evangelist and his qualifications there, and humility is chief among those things. At the same time, too, I would suggest that while we have this great desire to have a great knowledge, that in James chapter 3, it tells us that the wisdom of above is peaceable and gentle. There's an old Jewish proverb that says the highest form of wisdom is kindness. And while there's a temptation to say, hey, I need to learn as much as I can, I need to know everything, kindness, gentleness, humility, those are types of wisdom that in some ways may be more important to us sometimes than others. We have a sense where, well, I have to know everything in the Bible. But frankly, I think that our work on wisdom that is gentle and peaceable and kind may trump that to some degree. It's not as though we go into a congregation and we're the only one that has knowledge, but we are the demonstration of the peaceable and kind and good wisdom. So that advice given to me, I would pass on to a new preacher, that I would want them to understand that you don't need to know everything. You need to let brethren know that you don't know everything, but you can have the wisdom from above, the peaceable, kind, and gentle wisdom, the patience and humility that you demonstrate by your conduct and by your willingness to listen. I think those are just utterly important characteristics and qualities that a preacher needs to have.
All righty, I appreciate that Brian? Any thoughts or comments about that? Who am I hearing an echo from? I'm not hearing an echo.
Very good, Brian. Appreciate
Yeah.
that.
Yes.
Paul, I'm going to throw it to you because I think some of these, some of the ones that following may be good to bring out as well.
Okay, I'll pick up. I think I had mentioned these in a private discussion that we had. And one that I added in today is if I was going to give advice to a young preacher outside of those biblical things that we've been discussing, I would suggest to him that the preacher, young man who wants to preach, he needs to get his tax situation figured out. Preachers' taxes are pretty complicated. You may live in a preacher's house, or you may not. You may have an office at home, or you may not. And all that impacts things. Keeping records, diligent records because of miles that you travel and things like that, of different forms of income and different expenses. It's just a kind of a big deal. And I would try, if I was going back, I would try to get someone who was really knowledgeable in this to help me before maybe I even entered that first day of full-time preaching work, and try to get that figured out. It is a very complicated thing. By the way, by suggesting that, I'm not an expert on this. I struggle with it constantly, trying to understand and know all that I should be doing and what's required of me. But that would be one piece of advice that I would give. Another piece of practical advice is, no matter how you regard yourself, if you think you are quite attractive, or whether you think that you lack physical beauty, it really doesn't matter. Make it a policy to not set up appointments. I know there are sometimes situations that may be unavoidable if you keep any kind of office hours, but do not intentionally make appointments or counsel women by yourself. It is an invitation for trouble, whether there would be actual trouble or whether there would just be the potential to say something that would malign your good character. It's just a good policy never to allow that to happen. The next one I'm not sure was mine, but I'll go on to the one after that. And that is that when you get together with your, in a group of friends, or you're visiting another congregation, or maybe you're even holding a gospel meeting, don't talk about how bad the people are back home. Don't talk about all their faults. Be like Paul. Think highly of your brethren and talk about them. Give thanks for them and speak well of them to other people when you have to speak of the brethren that you work with on a week-to-week basis. That's not hard for me. I believe the Christians here are some of the just finest people and treat me so well. But I know that there are preachers who may not always have that experience, and that's okay. When you get other places, still speak and find the good things you can say about the brethren that you deal with. And that's all that I had today.
Yeah, and Paul, just let me mention that doubly applies to elders. And what I mean by that is speaking about your elders. And this past Sunday I was preaching on our responsibilities as Christians to our elders. One of the things that I said is never, ever, ever, ever about them to unbelievers. Not that you should do it to anybody, but don't complain to those who are not a part of the Lord's body.
Well, I've talked with the folks here about the fact that if there is any kind of an internal conflict between a couple of members, don't go to your friends out in the community and say, I just can't get along with this person. I don't think we have a lot of that. But don't have that harsh attitude when you're dealing with people, because when you invite them to come to services, they might say, well, why would I want to come there when you've told me about all the negatives? It hurts your evangelistic opportunities. And so let me just say this, truly regard your brethren highly, and let that be shown in the way in which you conduct yourself. John?
Makes sense, Paul. I think we had a couple comments that Brendan had put into the outline, and he's with us in spirit, so to speak, but he had some technical issues there. One of the things that Brendan pointed out, and Brian, you may have mentioned this earlier, is that you need to get to know the brethren with whom you are working. I use that term, with whom you are working, and that's the kind of the phrase that Brendan used. And it is a work, but they are your family. Even if you've only been there for 2 or 3 weeks, you have to view them as a family. They're your brothers and sisters in Christ. And you're right. You're not some outside contractor that's brought in to do a job and then go. You are there to get to know them and spend time with them. And Brendan also recommends find a Jonathan. Find someone that is closer to you than a brother. Solomon says there is a friend. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but that's not the one I want to quote. But he said, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. But there is one that sticks closer to you than a brother. You need to find someone like David found Jonathan that you converse with as a peer-on-peer conversation, and someone that you could really turn to with confidence to get help and suggestion and advice. And sometimes we just need someone to talk to. Sometimes as preachers, we need someone that we can talk to who won't really judge the situation. They're not going to try to jump in with every other statement to try to solve your problem. Sometimes solutions come by us just talking through them. And someone said, that's what's prayer for. And I know God's never interrupted me whenever I've prayed to him. But sometimes, it's helpful to have someone listen. And then they can be objective, maybe in ways that you cannot, and then offer something. And so both those are very good advices there.
I thought so too.
Go ahead, Paul.
I thought so too, John. I was just kind of working through that, and you need people who will be an honest critic. You probably have people who every time you do anything, they'll say, "Good job, appreciate that," and they are sincere and they're trying to help you. But certainly, every one of us have areas we need to work on and improve. We need to have such close friends that can. Maybe it's your wife. Maybe it's just a close friend. Say, that I'm not sure you were clear on your teaching. I think you could have prepared a little better. Whatever it is, they could sit down with you and talk through and to help you to be a better at bringing forth the Word of God. It's all about the Word. The power's in the Word. No question there. But people who can help you to do your best job in delivering that message clearly to the people.
I'll give you an example, Paul. A couple of Sundays ago, I was talking about Jacob in the dream at Bethel, and I really made this big drawn out point that, Jacob ventured out on his own, and he left his father's house, and he was going to travel 500 some odd miles to the home of Bethuel and the home of Laban, and here he was all on his own. And then one of our members, and this one of our members, really, really good to do this. He came up and said he wasn't all alone, and I'm expecting him to say, yeah, he had God with him. He said no. His father would have probably sent servants. He would have had cattle. He would have had a whole entourage of individuals helping to protect and take care of what he was traveling with. And I thought about that. That's I told you, a very, very good point, and one that I had clearly missed.
We don't know everything.
That's right. And even if we did, we can't remember it all. That's what hurts. But we don't. That's exactly right. There's one more thing I want to bring up real quick, and then Tom, I'll throw it to you if there's one other point you want to bring up. And this is going to sound really off the wall. But as a preacher, you need to be honest about your own personal mental health. You really do. Do you have highs? Do you have lows within your life? I'm not talking about full-on bipolar, but there may be times that you might be over-emotional. There may be times that you might be quick to anger. There may be times that your stress level is so high that it seriously impacts the way that you work. Depression is, and that's a good point, Paul, depression is something that can plague a preacher. There may be weeks, depending on your personality and your psyche and the chemical balance in your brain, where you may not get anything done. And it may be due to depression. It may be some sort of hyperactivity thing or distraction thing. And you have to be honest with yourself going into that and recognize what your limitations are and not let them control you, but you embrace them and accept responsibility for them. Something to think about. Any other thoughts or comments about that? All right, Tom, I'm going to throw it back to you for, is there one more point you want to bring up?
Yeah, well, I was just making an observation. A couple of them that I had. Don't let your preachings and thoughts be just about you. Whenever you're preaching, make sure that you realize you're preaching to a congregation, and it's about what they need. Now, a lot of times you might be preaching to yourself, and it just happens to be what everybody else needs. But that's true. And then the other observation, and this is just purely a recommendation, when you talk about, what is something that a preacher who's preaching can do? One of the advices that I would give is to find some sermon outline books of some older preachers. And develop some of the thoughts that they are, or develop some of the lesson titles maybe, and develop your own lesson out of it. And the reason I say that is because I think it's easy in some places. This is not always the case. I think it's easy in some places for us not to think about certain subjects, doctrinal issues and so on. And it's easy for them to get lost. And if you look at some of these, the things from the men of past generations, they will remind you of some issues that we still need to be aware of. And use that. And I'm not saying to preach their sermons. I'm saying, look at them and get some ideas from them, just to remind yourself of a different perspective.
Okay, as a tool. All right. Any other thoughts or comments?
And that was my thoughts.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that, Tom. And looking at the outline, do you think that we've covered most of them, guys?
I think so.
Yeah, I do.
Okay. All righty. Well, I'll tell you what, that's it. So if you're considering to be a type of person who devotes his life to studying the Word of God and working with local congregations and living of the gospel, that's just some advice that we have. And we're not old men by any stretch of the imagination. Tom, I think you're probably the oldest of us. Aren't you like 62? Or 57 or somewhere in there?
Yeah, 56.
56. and Paul and I are right around the 50 mark.
Or 55.
What's that?
55.
You're 55. Okay.
I'm 50.
All right, and I've hit 50, and then I think Eric and Brian, although Eric's not with us, probably close to the same age.
Yeah, I think so. I'm 43. So.
43, yeah. And then, of course, Wayne is one of the younger ones with Brendan as well. Mike, when he was with us, he was ancient. not that bad. But he actually, Mike is in his 60s, I think, so he definitely has some more experience on us as well. I guess we could do like some people. Combined we have well over 100 and almost 200 years worth of experience. So you need to listen to us and what we have to say.
And how many years of preaching do we have combined? That's the question.
No, that's a good point. Yeah. But anyway, we of course, we're having a little fun there with that. And it is a very serious subject. We recognize that. And I think it's a good thing to encourage young men to become gospel preachers. But you need to make sure they're well equipped for all areas of life. Never let anyone say, "Well, that's not important. You'll figure that out as you go along." You need to work on it before you ever make that lifetime commitment. I've seen preachers get out of preaching because of the stress and the challenges were just way too much. And
brethren have driven them out of it. Just dealing with them.
Tom, now listen, everybody. That's Tom at truthfactor.com. But I understand his point, though.
Yeah, and you know what? Let me go ahead and I've got to clarify that with what I was saying. I mean, brethren are going to be your best friends, but there are some brethren out there, for lack of a better term, they need to learn what it means to be a Christian, and the way that they treat you, the way that they treat other brethren.
Yeah,
the way
you're not
that they
wrong about
treat
that.
elders.
Yeah.
It discourages individuals, and the point that you're making, John, if you're not prepared for that,
Yeah.
you're going to be overwhelmed.
You know,
Probably.
And I'm not trying to attack brethren.
No, I know.
Please understand that. I mean, I'm blessed to be where I'm at, and I'm not being critical of my brethren here. And I know nobody here is being critical of your congregations, but there are brethren out there
Why?
that can become a concern.
That's right. Here's probably the thing that you have to embrace and memorize and embrace again before you start becoming a gospel preacher. Jesus was the perfect teacher. And the number of people that actually listened to him and followed him while he was alive was low by comparison to those who turned away from him. That's your life as a preacher. You're going to have fewer people to really listen and to pay attention and to be there to embrace and to learn with you. And there'll be a lot of people that you'll try to teach who will walk away from that. That's the way it is. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And John, who was it that were his worst nemesis? You know, next week we're going to start studying the gospel. Who were his nemesis? It was his brethren in the flesh.
That's true. And we'll try not to use nemesis too much during the next couple of weeks, but that's a good word to use, nemesis. All righty. Well, that brings us to the end of this study. And as Tom said, we mentioned earlier, next week is our 200th episode. Our 200th episode. So what we're going to do is we're going to launch into a study of the Gospel of Luke, Lord willing, next Wednesday. And we're going to take it one chapter a week. At least that's the approach. There are some chapters we may end up having to span over a 2-week period. But we're going to be starting Luke next week, the 200th episode. And you know, Paul, I may take the time to bring up some old footage of you, Tom, and I when we first began this study to kind of share with people. We weren't pretty then and we're not pretty today, but it might be something funny to go back and look at. All right, any other final?
Interesting.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Brian, any other final thoughts or comments?
I really can't think of anything. I think a lot of good advice and good observations have been given, and I hope that it's been profitable to our listeners.
All righty, same here. Paul, any final thoughts or comments?
No, looking forward to us getting into Luke, and it's been good for these years to be a part of the study, and looking forward to continuing in the Word.
All right, and Tom.
Right. Appreciate the study. Just realize that preaching is a very much needed occupation today. It's probably there's not enough preachers out there, and while it definitely has its challenges and materially it might not be the most rewarding occupation, but the benefits are, as I heard one person say, out of this world. So let's never forget that as we continue to strive to proclaim the truth of God's word.
That's a good point, Paul, or Tom. All right, appreciate everyone joining us today. And next week we'll have probably a fuller complement of our regular hosts back with us as we begin our study of Luke. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send those to questions@truthfactor.com, and we'll be more than happy to consider what you have to say and maybe even bring it into the study. Lord willing, we'll continue our broadcast next Wednesday as we begin our study of Luke at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
That's noon Eastern.
9 a.m. Pacific.
And 10 a.m. Mountain Time.
It's right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.